It's Dr. A. Want to do a quick notification about a newsletter that I have up on the website. And if you like newsletters because they have the references and research and a lot more writing and discussion than these videos, you can go to the description box below. There will be a link. Or if you just want to go to dranow.com, and the newsletter link will get you there as well. But this one is another COVID-related newsletter, and it's called COVID Therapeutics. Now, that could be a lot of things. Now, we talked about COVID and nutrients on a previous one of these, but what I'm talking about here are pharmaceutical drug intervention therapeutics. Now, this particular newsletter doesn't get into things like ventilation and those things that you do in the ICU, but I do go through the things I was asked the most questions about, which clustered around approved and pre-approved therapeutics. And I do make a note in the newsletter of the date that I wrote it, because everything is in evolution, and then things can get emergency use authorizations and suddenly be available. But what I was kind of talking about is there's a COVID therapeutics trackers systems that go on. For example, you get to vaccines for COVID. There's over 140 vaccines in development. Now in the US, we hear about 3. And that's because those are the 3 that we have. And then in Canada and the UK, there's slightly different ones. Some same, some different. But you can get an emergency use authorization, and it can be at market very, very quickly. So I talk in this about certainly about the vaccines and the technology behind the vaccines. I do stick to the ones that we now have under emergency use authorization, and talk about mechanics. How does it work? What do we know? How long have we used them or not? And it just gets into those things. Have some interesting quotes from people both related to and peripheral to the CDC, and other people who are involved in the vaccine world around them that I think are useful to look at. Other therapeutics include, you've heard of convalescent plasma maybe. Well, convalescent plasma is actually somebody else's antibodies because they had COVID. They extract those antibodies, hyperpurify them, and then they give them to you when you have COVID. So that's one way to get passive immunity. Now, what that's supposed to do is a couple of things. One is it gives you passive immunity. It's great. So this sometimes you hear about, not with COVID, but somebody will say, well, unfortunately they got hepatitis A and they got a gamma globulin injection. Well, that's giving you immune globulins against hepatitis A that were usually synthesized, and they give you an injection for it. This is kind of the same thing, only using human-derived globulins, antibodies. So it can kickstart your immunity and help protect you, etc. Now, also, because we now have the ability to synthesize antibodies in the lab, there are also pre-made antibodies that don't come from a human source. And those many are in development, but I talk in the newsletter about the more common ones. Those are more and more commonly being used now in many places, in outpatient centers where people are getting orders. They don't need to be in the hospital, but they're pretty sick, so they can go in the outpatient infusion center and get these antibodies given to them, used in the hospital as well, etc. And then there are the various combinations of antiviral drugs. Now, these can be kind of your standard, more modern biologic type antiviral drugs. They can also include some maybe off-label use drugs, such as, say, ivermectin or other antibiotics that are actually used off-label because COVID's not a bacteria. But there's actually other things that are done. But there's a lot of new, potentially exciting antiviral strategies that are from the more modern biologic world. And those can be quite useful as well, depending on your, there's a strategy for these. You get to your doctor with COVID and they kind of stratify you, and depending on how early or late in the process of illness you are, you may be offered different combinations of these, because it's better to give certain ones at certain times. So there's some background in there on those sorts of therapeutics as well. And then there's a discussion of other therapeutics that are under study. They're being researched. For example, there are off-label uses of some antacid H2 blocking drugs. There's off-label uses of aspirin. There's off-label all sorts of other things, and I get into those as well. So again, this is just to give you a flavor for what's in the newsletter, kind of talk through it. The newsletter, of course, gets into extreme depth and has references and resources for all of these things. And like with anything COVID, there's things that happen, the day after I put out a newsletter or the week after. So there's probably things in there that maybe weren't approved then, but now they are. And I try to call that out what date I was trying to write. So if you're interested in that, you can go to the description box below and get your link for this newsletter, or DRANOW, dranow.com. And you can get all the good, juicy details and all of the references as well. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to have your time. Please like, share, subscribe, all of those things, and I will appreciate seeing you again.